Welcome back to the Death Channel. Everyone loves a wander around an art museum. I will admit, I am particularly partial to the paintings of the 19th century. But unless you happen to have a particularly strong stomach, you may want to reconsider going anywhere near these paintings in the future. Mummy brown is a rather unusual pigment to say the least. You may have heard that bright red carmine comes from crushed beetles, but that's nothing compared to the source of mummy brown. This pigment originated in ancient Egypt and was extremely popular among macabre European artists from the 16th century right up until the 19th century. This rich brown colour was indeed made from the flesh of ground-up Egyptian mummies. That's right, back in the Victorian era, painters were smearing their canvases with the remains of dead people from thousands of years ago. So, how the bloody hell did this disgusting and frankly fascinating practice originate? Let's have a look into it. The tale of Mummy Brown is quite strange, and really rather gruesome. We have to go back quite a long way to find the beginning of the story of this strange pigment, right back to the Middle Ages, when Europeans first began exploiting Egyptian mummies for a whole variety of stomach-churning and possibly insane uses. But first, we have to go even further back in the sands of time, to ancient Egypt itself. Egyptian mummies date back 5,000 years. To say the Egyptians mummified a lot of people and animals would be something of an understatement. Some experts estimate the total number of mummified humans and animals to be as many as 70 million. Around the medieval era, Europeans began showing up in Egypt and started treating these ancient human remains like some kind of natural resource. And the belief was that these mummies could even be good for their health. This belief was loosely tied to the ancient Greeks' use of pitch or bitumen, which seeped from the earth in Persia and other parts of the Middle East. Bitumen is a viscous substance that is a constituent of petroleum or crude oil. Historians like Pliny the Elder and Dioscorides wrote that bitumen was used to treat various medical issues, from toothaches to worms to dysentery. How bitumen's medical reputation linked to Egyptian mummies exactly is uncertain. A common theory, based partly on Abdel Latif's 12th century writings, suggests that the blackened look of some mummies, caused by aging embalming materials, was mistakenly attributed to bitumen. This then led to the idea that mummies could be an alternative source of bitumen, which was becoming scarce around then due to the high demand. And to be fair to the folks of the Middle Ages, eventually these mummies would have ended up turning into crude oil. But at only a couple of thousand rather than a couple of million years old, they weren't quite done yet. Latif himself stated that the substance found in Egyptian corpses was similar to bitumen and could be used as a substitute when necessary. The Persian term for bitumen, mum or mumia, came to describe the bitumen-soaked bodies. And this is what led to the term mummy we use today. By the 16th century, the mummy trade was booming as mummies were exported from Egypt to Europe to be used as medicine. European governments outlawed the importation of mummies, but the black market was impossible to control. This decayed human flesh trade saw the establishment of collection and distribution businesses. English, Spanish, French, Germans, and others began trading mummies. They were exporting entire bodies or fragments from Cairo and Alexandria. As soon as mummies were deemed valuable for medicine, many speculators joined the trade. Before long, they were looting tombs and breaking mummies into pieces for sale. Both locals and foreigners dug up tombs and brought mummies to Cairo, where, as Abdel Latif recorded, it is sold for a trifle. For half a dirham I purchased 3 heads filled with the substance. One infamous corpse trader was John Sanderson, who was a London merchant and an agent for the Turkey Company. During his year in Egypt, he described his visit to the mummy pits of Memphis. These are his own words recorded in 1586. "We were let down by ropes, as into a well, with wax candles burning in our hands, and so walked upon the bodies of all sorts and sizes. They gave no noisome smell at all. I broke off all the parts of the bodies to see how the flesh was turned to drug, and brought home diverse heads, hands, arms and feet for a show. We brought also £600 for the Turkey Company in pieces, and brought into England in the Hercules, together with a whole body. They are wrapped in above 100 double of cloth, which, rotting and pilling off, you may see the skin, flesh, fingers and nails firm, altered black. One little hand I brought into England to show, and presented it to my brother, who gave the same to a doctor in Oxford. Beyond their medicinal use, mummies became attractions themselves. In 1668, Samuel Pepys described visiting a London dockside warehouse after a night of drinking to see an imported mummy before it was ground to pieces, which sounds exactly the kind of drunken lark you could still find yourself engaged in modern London if you're not careful. This is what Pepys said, and so parted, I having there seen a mummy in a merchant's warehouse there, all the middle of the man or woman's body, black and hard. I never saw any before, and therefore it pleased me much, though an ill sight. And he did give me a little bit, and a bone of an arm. These mummy pieces often ended up in a gentleman's cabinet of curiosities. One visitor to such a cabinet in 1639 described a collection that included items like 2 ribs of a whale, a pelican, the hand of a mermaid, and the hand of a mummy. Abuses in the mummy trade were inevitable. When genuine ancient mummies became scarce, suppliers turned to the corpses of criminals. Guy de la Fontaine, the King of Navarre's personal physician, investigated the mummy trade in Alexandria in 1564. He found that dealers were supplementing their stock with bodies of the recently dead, who were often executed criminals or slaves. These bodies were treated with bitumen and sun-dried to produce mummified tissue and then sold as authentic mummies. One merchant who, when asked about the origins of the bodies by Monsieur de la Fontaine, said that he cared not whence they came, whether they were old or young, male or female, or of what disease they had died, so long as he could obtain them. When embalmed, no one could tell. Sometimes even non-human remains were sold off as being human. Mummified children often turned out to be mummified ibises, and counterfeit mummies sometimes included the flesh of camels. Once they arrived in Europe, they were repackaged and marketed as mumia. Mumia was the powder of the ground-up body parts. They were applied topically, or rather horrifyingly, mixed into drinks. Its medical benefits were praised in standard pharmacopoeia and widely promoted by physicians, apothecaries, and barber surgeons. By the 16th and 17th centuries, it had become one of the most common drugs in European apothecaries' shops. Back in those days, if you questioned the efficacy of chugging down as much ground-up mummy powder as you could take, you'd probably find yourself in all kinds of trouble with the authorities. Makes you glad times have changed so much. Other prominent figures of the time supported the use of mummy as medicine. Philosopher Francis Bacon said that mummy hath great force in staunching of blood, while the great chemist Robert Boyle noted it was one of the useful medicines commended and given by our physicians for falls and bruises. Shakespeare's son-in-law, John Hall, treated epilepsy by burning a mix of benzoic resin, powdered mummy, black pitch, and rue juice. The fumes worked as a sedative. Francois I of France always carried a pouch filled with mumia and pulverized rhubarb. He was confident it could cure anything from headaches to broken bones. Catherine de' Medici even sent her chaplain on a special mission to Egypt in 1549 to get hold of some of the finest mumia available. In short, everyone had gone mad for mummies. But what was the actual theory behind it, besides the fact it was making a few people fabulously wealthy? Aside from the alleged benefits of bitumen, there was a whole theory of transferal of life forces from one being to another to be considered. Paracelsus, a Swiss-German medical reformer of the 16th century, believed eating animal flesh could transfer its qualities to the eater. This might make eating mummies seem counterintuitive, given that they are very much dead and unlikely to be great sources of life force. But mummies supposedly still had a bit left over that you could eat to rejuvenate yourself. However, Paracelsus was in danger of sending the whole thing into a cannibalistic frenzy. As mummies became scarce, Paracelsus argued that fresher bodies could work just as well, if not better. He began to advocate eating the recently dead, once writing, "If doctors were aware of the power of this substance, no body would be left on the gibbet for more than 3 days." Johann Schröder, a follower of Paracelsus, was more detailed. He recommended using the cadaver of a reddish man, because in such a man the blood is believed lighter, and so the flesh is better, whole, fresh without blemish, of around 24 years of age, dead of a violent death, not of illness, exposed to the moon's rays for 1 day and night. Suddenly, being a 24-year-old reddish man was a very dangerous thing to be. Pretty much everyone was looking at you as a potential meal. So once you'd violently dispatched your healthy young reddish man, how would you go about eating him? Well, the flesh would be treated to resemble smoke-cured meat, a kind of rapid mummification process. This would remove any stench that might have arisen after leaving it out under the moon for a night. Then it could be enjoyed at leisure, in the same way one might enjoy a cured ham, although this was all some time before the momentous invention of the sandwich at least. If you lived in southern Europe, reddish men might be in short supply. Down there they believed the best mummy came from young, virginal women. Pietro della Valle, an early 17th century physician, claimed the best mummy was from the maidens and the bodies of virgins. Not everyone shared this enthusiasm for murder and cannibalism. Egyptian merchants who sold mummy to Europe were amazed that Christians who were, quote, so dainty-mouthed could eat the bodies of the dead. This sentiment was echoed by many in Europe. Preacher Richard Hakluyt noted in 1599 that these dead bodies are the mummies which the physicians and apothecaries do against our wills make us to swallow. In 1658, philosopher Sir Thomas Browne cynically remarked, "Mummy is become merchandise, Mizraim cures wounds, and Pharaoh is sold for balsams." He also said, "Surely such diet is dismal vampirism, and exceeds in horror the black banquet of Domitian, not to be paralleled except in those Arabian feasts, wherein ghouls feed horribly." Another one who wasn't sure about gobbling down mummies for his health was William Shakespeare. Shakespeare mentions the practice in Macbeth, where the witches add witch's mummy to their cauldron, alongside a dog's tongue and the finger of birth-strangled babe. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, Falstaff, contemplating his own death by drowning, imagines he would become a mountain of mummy. The poet John Donne, in his 1590 poem Love's Alchemy, describes women as but mummy possessed, which is perhaps a bit unfair to the ladies of the 16th century. Ben Jonson's Volpone has Mosca suggest selling a body for mumia. He's half dust already. And in John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi, Bosseler describes the Duchess's body as a box of wormseed, at best but a salvatory of green mummy. Some doctors also disdain mummy medicine. In 1546, the German Leonhard Fuchs called it the gory matter of cadavers received evidently from the gallows or from the torture wheel, spotted with the feces of corpses in place of aloes and myrrh. The respected physician Ambroise Paré dismissed its benefits. This wicked kind of drug doth nothing to help the diseased. It also infers many troublesome symptoms, such as the pain of the heart or stomach, vomiting, and stink of the mouth. I, persuaded by these reasons, do not only myself prescribe any hereof to my patients, but also in consultation, endeavour what I may, that it be not prescribed by others. But people weren't interested in the sceptical views of professional doctors or acute minds like Shakespeare and Johnson. They were much more interested in the mummy powder-selling quack merchants of London, Paris, Naples, Lisbon, and Amsterdam, who wandered the streets with spectacular promises of the powers of the mummy elixir. However, the suspicion that mummy medicine contributed to the plague outbreaks of the mid-17th century may have begun its decline as a medicine. Although it remained in medical catalogues until the 18th century, its use dwindled. Remarkably, in 1973, a New York shop still offered witches' supplies that included powdered mummy. Even as mummy medicine waned, Napoleon's 1798 invasion of Egypt reignited public fascination with the country among the French and the British. This interest had two main aspects. First, scientific curiosity was sparked by the Description de l'Égypte, which was a lavishly illustrated 10-volume work documenting Egypt's monuments, technology, geography, flora, and fauna. This work was based on research by over 160 scholars and scientists who accompanied Napoleon's expedition. Second, the Egyptian authorities' desire to modernize and open the country to the West, along with spectacular archaeological finds, made tourism prestigious and fashionable. The whole concept of tourism had been popularized by Lord Byron's mad adventures across Europe, and now there was a large number of British aristocrats and other nouveau riche types ready to go on tour. By the 1830s, Europeans had gone completely Egypt mad. Diplomats, tourists, merchants and dukes competed to amass collections of mummies and antiquities. This mania led to fierce competition, with collectors clambering over ruins, sifting through rubble, and bargaining with locals for ancient remains. In 1833, a Father Jérôme remarked that returning from Egypt without a mummy in one hand and a crocodile in the other would be unthinkable. Some local guides even transported mummies to popular tourist spots to ensure visitors were not disappointed. In those days, having a severely decomposed Egyptian under your arm was the equivalent of a Birkin bag. Upon returning to Europe, a peculiar trend emerged among the tourists: the practice of mummy unwrappings, or unrollings. These events were often scientific, but could also be quite sensational. A late 19th century painting by Philippe Otto illustrates an unwrapping of a mummified priestess by members of a French scientific team at Deir el-Bahn. In England, Thomas Mummy Pettigrew was a prominent figure in public mummy unrollings, as you might be able to guess from his nickname. A surgeon and antiquarian, Pettigrew was a leading expert on Egyptian mummies and authored the classic History of Egyptian Mummies. He was also the founding treasurer of the British Archaeological Society. Pettigrew was both a scholar and a showman. He began his unrolling exhibitions in 1833 at Charing Cross Hospital's Lecture Theatre. These events were popular, often selling out and leaving people turned away at the door. He conducted unrollings at various venues, including the Royal Institute and private gatherings, where he would unwrap and sometimes autopsy a mummy for the education and entertainment of his guests. The French novelist and critic Théophile Gautier described an unrolling at an archaeological and funereal meeting during the exhibition of 1857. He wrote, "The work of unrolling the bandages began. The outer envelope, of stout linen, was ripped open with scissors. A faint, delicate odour of balsam, incense, and other aromatic drugs spread through the room like the odour of an apothecary's shop. The end of the bandage was then sought for, and when found, the mummy was placed upright to allow the operator to move freely around her and to roll up the endless band, turned to the yellow colour of ecru linen by the palm wine and other preserving liquid. A vast quantity of linen filled the room, and we could not help wondering how a box which was scarcely larger than an ordinary coffin had managed to hold it all." Small ornaments appeared during the unwrapping, with Gautier noting, "In mummy cases there are often discovered numbers of these small trifles, possibly scarabs, and every curiosity shop is full of similar blue enamelled ware figures." As the unwrapping continued, two white eyes with great black pupils shone with fictitious life between brown eyelids. They were enamelled eyes, such as it was customary to insert in carefully prepared mummies. The clear, fixed glance, gazing out of the dead face, produced a terrifying effect. The body seemed to behold with disdainful surprise the living beings that moved around it. Little by little, the body began to show in its sad nudity. Is it not a surprising thing? One that seems to belong to the realm of dreams, to see on a table, in still appreciable shape, a being which walked in the sunshine, which lived and loved 500 years before Moses, 2,000 years before Jesus Christ. It appears that not all mummy unwrappings were conducted with scholarly rigour. Unwrapping mummies became a popular form of Victorian parlour entertainment, though the prevalence of this practice is uncertain. No doubt it would be the highlight of any social gathering, or perhaps a birthday party with a few candles inserted into the mummy. Considering that Europeans consume mummies in various forms of food, drink and medicine, it is not too surprising to learn that they also use them in their art. This is where we come to our infamous mummy brown. Mummy brown was a rich brown colour made from mummy flesh mixed with white pitch and myrrh. It was also sometimes known as caput mortuum or Egyptian brown. In 1712, a Parisian artist supply shop named Alamomi sold paints and varnishes alongside powdered mummy, incense and myrrh, and was one of the earliest recorded suppliers of mummy brown. Mummy brown remained available from artist suppliers well into the 20th century. And it was a fairly efficient resource. One mummy provided material that could satisfy customer demand for 20 years, according to a London supplier quoted in 1915. Specific documented uses of mummy brown in artworks are in truth quite rare. This is likely because the pigment's composition varied widely, making it hard to identify without techniques like mass spectrometry. However, it is generally accepted that mummy brown was commonly used by artists from the 16th century and right through the 19th century. Its good transparency made it suitable for oil paints and possibly watercolours, used for glazing, shadows, flesh tones and shading. So, if you see any paintings from this era that have a rather pleasing brown shade in them, it's quite likely there's a ground-up mummy in there somewhere. In fact, the pigment saw its peak popularity from the mid-18th to 19th centuries. In 1849, it was described as being quite in vogue. It was one of the pigments on Delacroix's palette in 1854 for painting the Salon de la Paix at the Hôtel de Ville. The British portraitist Sir William Beechey also used it. The pre-Raphaelite Edward Burne-Jones utilised it in 1881, and it is likely that Alma Tadema and other colleagues did as well. The French artist Martin Drelling purportedly even used mummy brown made from the remains of French kings disinterred from Saint-Denis in Paris, with his painting L'Intérieur d'une cuisine being a notable example. However, not everyone was impressed by mummy brown, with many artists frustrated at the variable quality of the pigment. One artist, Osborne, said, "It is not particularly prudent to employ without necessity these crumbled remains of dead bodies, liable to injure the colours with which they may be united. We ourselves have never yet felt the least desire to assay this pigment, seeing nothing to be gained by smearing our canvas with a part perhaps of the wife of Potiphar, that might not be as easily secured by materials less frail and of more sober character." Whether it was really the best quality brown pigment or not, mummy brown continued to be used for 4 centuries. Its demise, however, was imminent. Georgina Burne-Jones, in her biography of the great Edward Burne-Jones, recalls a pivotal moment. Lawrence Alma Tadema and his family were visiting the Burne-Jones household. Alma Tadema mentioned he had been invited to see a mummy in a colourman's workshop before it was ground into paint. Edward Burne-Jones, sceptical, had always believed the name mummy was merely a descriptor for a shade of brown. When convinced it was indeed made from real mummy, he immediately retrieved his only tube of the pigment and insisted they give it a proper burial. They dug a hole in the grass, buried the tube, and one of the girls marked the spot by planting a daisy root above it. This peculiar, yet rather poignant episode left a lasting impression on those present, which happened to include a young Rudyard Kipling, Georgina's nephew. Kipling spent every December with the Burne-Jones family at their London home. Decades later, he recounted the event. Burne-Jones descended in broad daylight with a tube of mummy brown in his hand, saying that he had discovered it was made of dead pharaohs and we must bury it accordingly. So we all went out and helped, according to the rites of Mizraim and Memphis, I hope. And to this day, I could drive a spade within a foot of where that tube lies. Burne-Jones's gesture reflected a growing unease with Mummy Brown, as awareness of its gruesome origins spread and respect for the scientific, archaeological, anthropological and cultural significance of mummies increased. The use of the pigment declined. Robertsons of London, a long-established artist supplier, continued to stock Mummy Brown until the 1930s, but by then it was rarely sold. By 1964, the stock had finally run out. The managing director of Robertsons regretfully admitted, "We might have a few odd limbs lying around somewhere, but not enough to make any more paint. We sold our last complete mummy some years ago for, I think, £3. Perhaps we shouldn't have. We certainly can't get any more." However, the concept of incorporating human remains into art persists. Families can now have a portion of their loved one's ashes mixed into the colours of a handcrafted artwork, such as a piece of jewellery, a perfume bottle, or a vase. And as we saw in a previous video, people love to make jewellery from the hair of their dead loved ones again. So maybe somehow we will see a slightly less ethically dubious revival of Mummy Brown one day. Until then, remember to bring a sick bag with you next time you go to the Louvre, the Tate, or the Smithsonian. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Death Channel. If you liked it, why not subscribe and come back for another video? Until then, see you on the other side.